I'm in Bendigo in central Victoria, and behind me is the Great Stupa of Universal Compassion, the largest stupa in the southern hemisphere. All around the outside of this place you can find various iconography from religions all around the world, including Catholicism and Judaism and Hinduism and Buddhism, including Thai Buddhism. I think there was Chinese Buddhism as well. There's a dragon statue, there's a statue of a kangaroo. It's very strange and very disorienting walking around this place. And it's also kind of strange just approaching it. It's like you're going through the middle of the desert and then out of nowhere you see something which would look more at home in Tibet or in Nepal. It's an almost otherworldly sight. Rising 48 metres at its centre, the Great Stupa of Universal Compassion stands in stark contrast with the dry Australian bush. Buried beneath its 50 square metre base at each point of the compass are 4 metal vases filled with gold, medicine and mantras. Spread across the 200-hectare property surrounding it are monasteries, living quarters, and gardened paths scattered with religious iconography from around the globe. Inside are workshops, teaching rooms, and even a small library. And at its core sits the largest jade Buddha in the world, the jewel in the crown of the largest stupa outside of Asia, and a purported source of miracles. But why here? And what bizarre sequence of events led the son of a wealthy landowner to finance its construction on the ruins of a long-forgotten theme park? Before we can answer these questions, we first need to understand exactly what we're looking at here. A stupa is a kind of Buddhist temple originating in pre-5th century India. The word literally translates as heap or pile, and early stupas were just that, a mound of dirt faced with stone used to mark the burial place of Buddhist artifacts. Most famously, the ashes of the Buddha were buried beneath 4 stupas located at key locations from his life, including Bodh Gaya, where he achieved enlightenment, and Sarnath, where he gave his first sermon. Depending on who you ask, a stupa could represent a mountain or the very universe. However, most scholars seem to agree that the shape represents the Buddha himself, seated in quiet meditation, with the base representing his legs crossed in lotus pose, the middle his body, and the apex his crowned head. Buddhists believe that by visiting stupas they can better understand the Buddha's teachings, the essence of which is that desire is the cause of all suffering, and can only be overcome through a balanced and spiritual lifestyle. It was the pursuit of such a lifestyle that led eccentric millionaire Ian Green to build this stupa in the Australian outback. His story goes a little something like this. After graduating university in the late 60s, Green was living a life of excess and luxury in the advertising industry.
I then leapt into hedonism headlong, so I had lots of girlfriends, lots of drinking, lots of gambling at poker and so forth. But somehow or another, I sort of came to the realisation, unless I do something about this, I'm going to end up in a very early grave. So, not with much forethought, I decided I would go to India and maybe I would find some answers there.
Standing before the Great Stupa of Sarnath in Varanasi, Green claims to have been struck by a feeling of tranquility he had never experienced before, a feeling that he wished to share.
As soon as I went into the park, I felt like I'd suddenly entered a new reality. Somehow I felt completely peace. Shortly after that, I came across this enormous, describe it as a bit like a big lump. I couldn't work out whether it was man-made or whether it was natural. It was covered with all these little ferns and bushes and so forth. I saw a sign that this was the Damak Stupa. This was Sarnath, or Deer Park, which is the place where the Buddha first taught. Later on, before I left the park, there was a little shop. I bought a little book, What is Buddhism? On the plane coming back to Australia, I actually flicked the book open and started to read it. And suddenly, I had this great feeling of affinity, as if, I'm completely familiar with this, but I don't remember seeing any of these words written like this.
By the time he returned home in the early 70s, Green had decided that it was his destiny to spread Buddhism to Australia. he joined the Tara Institute, a Tibetan Buddhist group in Melbourne, where he met his wife, Judy, and quickly became a prominent member of the community. It was also around this time that Green met two Tibetan monks, Lama Thupten Yeshe and Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who would become his spiritual mentors.
And that's when my practice really transformed. And I think when I discovered with him was that I certainly had found the path for me. I'd found a path that made total sense to my head, but also to my heart. It felt a bit like falling in love in a way, that I had this incredible connection that somehow when I looked into Lama's eyes, I could see that he completely accepted me and that I was willing to do anything I could to try and help him in whatever way he wanted.
But the Buddhists had a problem. They wanted to build an off-the-grid spiritual retreat and couldn't find the right spot. It's at this point that another character enters our story, Ed Green, Ian's father. Ed had at some point come into the possession of 700 acres of land just west of Bendigo, and decided to donate 50 acres to Ian and his new Buddhist friends. Exactly how Ed came into the possession of the fortune necessary to make such a purchase is unclear, although he does seem to have some connections to the steel manufacturer Stramit. What is clear is how the land was being used. Victorian residents will be quite familiar with Sovereign Hill, a Gold Rush era theme park in the nearby city of Ballarat. They are likely less familiar with Sandhurst Town, a similar heritage park built by the Green family, complete with a distillery, horse-drawn cart and period actors. Unfortunately, there is very little information available online about Sandhurst Town, including exactly when it closed down. What is documented is that in March 1981, Ian, along with his wife and 3 sons, moved into a disused railway carriage in his father's theme park and wrote to the Tibetan lamas about the good news. 6 months later, and the Greens had built their spiritual retreat in Sandhurst Town and named it the Atisha Centre. The opening of the Atisha Centre was characterised by 2 miracles performed by Lama Yeshe that carry all the hallmarks of religious myth-making. In the first story, when a storm threatened to ruin the opening festival, Lama Yeshe is claimed to have prayed the weather clear. Early that morning, Judy paid him a visit at his house. Lama asked, "Is there anything I can do to help?" Judy replied, almost as a joke, "Well, Lama, you could fix the weather for us." Lama smiled and said, "Okay." Later in the morning, Lama was seen making offerings to the deities. And while black clouds continued to come low overhead for the whole day, they were witnessed by many to separate overhead and leave a hole of blue sky over the open day. There was not a drop of rain. The second story is less dramatic, but far more impactful. Ian Green and Lama Yeshe took a walk, and Yeshe told Green his vision. He envisaged the construction of a self-sustaining Buddhist community, and, at its centre, the Great Stupa of Universal Compassion.
And he grabbed a stick and drew in the ground, and pointing up to his left, he said, "That's where we will build a big stupa. And in that big stupa will be a big gompa." Now, gompa is the Tibetan word for a temple. "And there'll be a library." And then pointing over to the right, he said, "Over there will be a lay village."
It was a fateful conversation, and Ian felt the distant echoes of his advertising career. The way he reasoned, the big symbols of the 21st century were sport, retail and commerce, and if he truly wanted to popularise Buddhism in Australia, he would need to make something just as big. Ian Green had found his purpose. But an external symbol wasn't enough. The biggest stupa in the Western world would need a draw card, and it would have to be equally as spectacular. In 2003, Green became aware of an 18-ton boulder of Nefertiti jade that had recently been discovered in the Arctic regions of Canada. Nicknamed Polar Pride, the gem had been causing waves in the gem community for its rarity and size. After a trip to Canada to inspect the boulder, Ian met with his other spiritual mentor, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who told him of his vision, that the Polar Pride would be carved into a jade Buddha to illuminate the world and help prevent the destruction that is happening, including war.
Anyway, he didn't say much that night, but the next morning he came back to me and he had this vision and he said, "You must make this boulder into a Buddha as an offering to peace to the world. It will be so significant. You must do this." So my initial thought was, I'm already building this enormous stupa. Do I really need another big project? But somehow or another, because Lama Zopa felt it was so important, and I had, such devotion to Lama Zopa as well, then I thought, well, if he thinks it's that important, then I'll have to find a way to make it happen.
After purchasing Polar Pride for an undisclosed price, the next 5 years were devoted to forming it into what would become the Jade Buddha for Universal Peace. The statue would be modelled on the Buddha inside the Mahabodhi Stupa in Bodh Gaya, where the historical Buddha achieved enlightenment. It would be shaped by master sculptors in Australia and Thailand, and have its face painted with non-reflecting gold by a renowned Nepalese artist. By the time it was finished and consecrated by the Dalai Lama in Sydney in 2009, the Jade Buddha for Universal Peace was 2.5 metres tall and valued at $5 million, the largest gem-quality Jade Buddha in the world. Over the next 9 years, the Jade Buddha was taken on a world tour of over 100 cities across Australia, Asia, Europe and America, where it was visited by 12 million people. At every viewing, witnesses reported seeing a strange light phenomenon in photographs taken around the Buddha, which are usually referred to as mandala lights. According to the Stupa's official website, these lights are symmetric in design, semi-transparent, and made of many colours when enlarged. Elsewhere, they have been described as ghost energy, flowers from heaven, and Buddha fields, with witnesses claiming to have seen concentric rainbows and even a photo of a child. An unknown source on Wikipedia claims that only those with a pure heart and pure intentions can photograph the mandala lights, while another commentator argues that the fact that we cannot see them with our eyes, but only through photos, is due to our karma. Personally, I would argue that mandala lights are likely airborne dust particles, or water droplets, suspended in front of the camera, which have been elsewhere mistaken as ghost orbs in ghost hunting circles. This diagram sums it up nicely. The closer to the camera's lens the object is with respect to the camera's focal point, the blurrier that it appears. Furthermore, it will take on an elongated shape due to lens curvature and will tend to take on the shape of the camera's aperture. For example, if the aperture of the camera is octagonal in shape, particles will appear octagonal, or in other words, mandala shaped. You can actually find photos and videos of people intentionally producing this effect with different apertures online, and some of the results are remarkably similar to images captured during the Buddha's world tour. But I digress. Today, the Jade Buddha is back on display, and construction of the great stupa that houses it is ongoing. Every day, volunteers work to carve and paint decorations that will one day fill the main temple chamber in a project we were told would last another 100 years. But regardless of whether Green will live to see that day, his legacy will undoubtedly endure. In the peace gardens that surround the stupa, there are currently monuments to Catholicism, Judaism, Hinduism and Sikhism, as well as a few more abstract designs. The purpose of these statues is to show how global religions share similar core beliefs, and plans are underway for religious iconography from local Islamic and indigenous Jajawarong communities. Meanwhile, to the north of the stupa, plans are in development for a temple designed to house a sapling from the Bodhi tree, which Green purchased in 2021. And with so much land to work with and increasing interest from tourism and government, it's likely that there is much more to come. In less than 50 years, this land has been transformed from a commercial theme park to a religious refuge forged by Ian Green and his true believers. But why? According to the website, the stupa intends to provide Australian Buddhists with a pilgrimage place and meditation retreat, while inspiring and explaining Buddhism to those willing to listen. But while the museum and library do a good job outlining these concepts, it's the contradiction that captured my interest. An Asian stupa in the Australian outback. Like Green says on his website, when you drive up through the bush, it's awe-inspiring, like a spaceship or an ancient Incan ruin. But it's not just the stupa that seems contradictory. Ian Green left the self-serving materialism of the advertising industry in search of a deeper purpose, and found it in a religion that preaches how true happiness can only be found by escaping all desire. When he writes about the day that he stood before the great stupa of Sarnath, Ian describes feeling totally at peace, as if he had just come home after wandering for a very long time. 50 years later, after numerous TV interviews and touring the world, I wonder if Green has found the end of his suffering and the purpose that he so long desired.